Racism, discrimination or prejudice based on race.
Among those hit by gunfire were 3 boys.
The volume of cases have increased.
Extreme, extending far beyond the norm.
Gunmen had opened fire on some of their playmates.
It represents a delusional disorder.
Targeting minorities, blacks, Asians, Jews.
Some would say they are sick.
2 Asian men are gunned down inside a Chinese restaurant.
Psychiatry is racist.
Even deranged.
Targeted by a man exploding with racial hatred.
Trying to get to the roots of what motivates bigots and racists is very important.
But are they mentally ill?
You could actually prevent people from harming those people.
Right. Tonight, racism in the extreme. When does a social ill become a mental illness? Let's begin with the proposition that a mild dose of racism may be quite normal. Not commendable, surely, but normal, in the sense that so many among us express or exhibit, or at least secretly harbor occasional feelings that their group is, after all, inferior to ours. Litigation and political correctness have ensured that we don't openly discuss such things much anymore, but it continues. Racism is toxic at every level, but is there a point at which it becomes abnormal? Hurling a brick through someone's window, perhaps, or burning a cross on his front lawn. And if we can agree that this would constitute abnormal behavior, is there a further point at which we can label it sick, demonstrably, clinically sick? Is there, in other words, a point at which a person's level of racism rises or sinks to the condition of mental illness? It is, after all, a slippery slope. If, as many believe, Adolf Hitler was mentally ill, how many of his colleagues in the Nazi hierarchy might have been similarly diagnosed? And what of the hundreds of thousands of lesser functionaries who participated in the Holocaust? All mentally ill? You may be surprised to learn that not very much significant research has been applied to the question. But here, now, as Nightline correspondent Michelle Martin reports, tragic headlines are forcing one prominent African-American psychiatrist to ask, why not?
August 10th, 1999.
We have an 8-year-old male with gunshot wounds to his thighs.
A white supremacist stormed into the North Valley Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles and started shooting.
We had to triage the children.
3 little boys, a camp counselor, and a receptionist were wounded.
We do have a shooter that's still at large.
The gunman then killed a Filipino mailman several miles away. When he was arrested, Buford Farrow seemed eager to tell the world he was a racist. But he had also tried to tell the world he was sick. The year before the shooting, he had tried to commit himself to a psychiatric hospital, saying he wanted to shoot people and kill himself. But Farrow threatened a nurse with a knife before he could be admitted. After treatment at 2 psychiatric hospitals, he spent 5 months in jail. Just 10 weeks after his release, Farrow went on his shooting spree. A psychiatrist who had treated him said later, hospitals cannot hold people just because they are racist or express the desire to do violence against certain groups. And that point of view is backed up by the American Psychiatric Association. The association decides what constitutes a legitimate mental illness and then affords recognition with a listing in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, the Bible of psychiatrists worldwide, now in its 4th edition.
In the index of this manual, in the United States, the word racism is not in the index, the word prejudice is not in the index, the word bigotry is not in the index.
Harvard psychiatrist Alvin Poussant has insisted for years that extreme racism is a mental illness and should be listed in the DSM.
Extreme racism is treatable, and sometimes even lesser forms of racism are treatable because they have psychodynamics to them. They don't exist as a social problem, they also exist as psychological problems inside the individual.
But I think other people would say, well, gosh, they're already in distress, they're showing signs of impairment. What difference does it make what you call it?
Their delusions were very, very specifically directed in a racist way.
And you think if those specific delusions were treated that you could perhaps save people? You think you could actually prevent people from harming those people?
Right. That's absolutely correct.
The Psychiatric Association remains skeptical about diagnosing extreme racism. In a letter to the New York Times, then Association President Daniel Borenstein did say Poussin's idea is compelling, but that designations are not developed through social or political demands, but through deliberate scientific research.
They didn't say that gays were no longer sociopaths because they did research. They did it because the gay rights movement put so much pressure on them that they backed off. And you know how they decided whether it was a mental illness or not? They put it to a vote of the membership of the association.
But that practice ended 20 years ago, members of the association said. Now the standard for inclusion in the DSM is a significant and persuasive body of research.
Let's look at this. Let's be objective about this.
To answer Poussin's charges, the American Psychiatric Association suggested we talk with Dr. Carl Bell, clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois Chicago Medical School and CEO of Community Mental Health Council, where about 400 low-income patients receive treatment each year.
Let's not make the same mistakes that other people have made in being political about using psychiatry as a political tool. Because it's not supposed to be that.
Bell wants the Psychiatric Association to conduct more research into racism, as does Poussin. In fact, the more we talk to Carl Bell, the more he seems to agree with Alvin Poussin.
I think Poussin is absolutely right, that for the most part, psychiatry is racist in the sheer denial that the problem exists. So he's got a point there. He's got a point because it is a toxic behavior, and he's got a good point. That seems reasonable to me, too. He's correct again, so he's right.
I got to tell you, Dr. Bell, everything you've said so far, not everything, but most of what you said so far seems to me to indicate that support for Dr. Poussin's position, because what he's saying is that by lifting out that behavior as a specific diagnosis, you call attention to it socially and politically, you put professionals on notice that this behavior is inappropriate, undesirable, and needs to be addressed, that you call it out, that you make it bad, and you tell people you got to do something about this, and that it can't be allowed. So but you're resistant, so why?
And you take society off the hook for promulgating negative racist stereotypic propaganda. You possibly remove the legal responsibility that the individual has around controlling their behavior.
The fear is that criminal defendants would plead insanity by reason of extreme racism to avoid punishment. But prosecutors and defense lawyers say, and at least one study shows, that only a small percentage of defendants ever attempt the insanity defense, and an even smaller number are successful. You're on a committee that assesses personality disorders and is going to be making recommendations to the Psychiatric Association for their next diagnostic manual. You brought up the issue of studying racism. What was the response?
The response from the committee was chilly. It's a good way of putting it. They sort of shut me down kind of quickly. And you're asking, to some extent, the people who are perpetrating the negative stereotypic images on television, in society, all over the place, to study themselves, which they have not done, and unless something happens, they're not going to do.
Hey there, you look like perceptive people above average.
Prejudice is in your face.
Good job. I mean, sure, some of them are homeless, but let's face it, you can tell which ones are just lazy, right? It's lazy thieving.
And that's the point.
But I can tell you're not like that. You're my kind of people. Bright, sensitive, geniuses. So, it's time to step through the door. And remember, I like you.
It's called the Museum of Tolerance at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles.
protect you. Take their goddamn guns from them.
Visitors are asked to confront bigotry of all kinds.
And remember in phonics? So I says to the professor, teacher, teacher.
We have witnessed the reemergence of large-scale massacres.
What we're trying to teach at the Museum of Tolerance, it is understanding that everyone has comes to the table with their own prejudices, and trying to go from there.
Rabbi Abraham Cooper is Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Cooper is concerned that a diagnosis of extreme racism could allow criminals to escape punishment. But Cooper admits perhaps such a diagnosis could help prevent hate crimes.
We have to look to every aspect of society, every body of expertise to help us identify people or strategies to make sure they don't act again.
The impact would be rather slight with regard to the cases in which I've been involved in.
Federal prosecutor Michael Giannacco led the team of government lawyers in the Buford-Furrow case. He's been prosecuting hate crimes for the last 15 years in more than 20 states.
The federal definition of insanity would not include extreme racism as a defense, because in order to be insane under the federal system, you have to not be able to know the difference between right and wrong.
If somebody was black, Hispanic, or Asian, and they got caught in my neighborhood, they didn't make it out of my neighborhood without being beaten.
T.J. Lydon, reformed skinhead, former Marine, former convict, and father of two.
So I became a racist recruiter, actively targeting kids from the age of 12 years old and older to join the white power movement. I'm probably sure some people maybe in the movement thought I was a little crazy sometimes. That's my back. Skinhead down the back of my arms. You guys see up there in the upper left-hand corner, see those crossed hammers? That is a tattoo of Hammerskin Nation, the world's biggest gang. It's white.
I'd like to ask you, do you think that it's possible that you were at some point suffering from a mental illness?
I think what it was is that more the fact is that as I progressed also, I learned the fact of basically brainwashing somebody.
I'm hearing that you had a hair-triggered temper. I'm hearing that you had an alcohol problem. I'm hearing that your alcohol and your attitude problems interfered with your losing your job, or at least the job you had chosen in the Marine Corps. Isn't that correct? You were separated from the service because of your alcohol and because of your fighting. And I have to assume, based on what you've told me, that a lot of your fighting was related to your racial attitudes, right?
Some of it, yes.
Sounds to me like your racist attitudes interfered with your ability to function properly.
In some cases, but I'm also Irish.
I have no idea what to say to that.
But I mean, I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. I mean, Irish people like to drink and fight.
So the racism piece for you, what you're saying is, racism wasn't a mental illness, it was normal. It had become normal. And dealing with the world that way had become normal.
Yeah, completely 100% normal.
Lydon continues to receive psychological counseling to help with his transition from the culture of hate.
I want you guys to help me make sure one kid doesn't get involved, one kid at a time. And what you will do by that is, you'll prevent there ever being another me in this society. I want to thank you all for listening to me.
A lot of young men who join hate groups, who were involved with hate ideology, will graduate out.
Ed Dunbar is one of the few psychologists in the nation who is actively researching those who commit hate crimes. Dunbar has begun cataloging the LAPD's hate crime database, performing what he calls psychological autopsies.
Any of the actions strike any of you as being disorganized or bizarre in any... What I'm trying to do with the LAPD is really look very closely at the individual, what they do, who they do it to, understand the kind of aggression, patterns of aggression that they utilize.
Dunbar has come to categorize racism by degree. At one end of the spectrum are people who simply avoid people of other races. Then there are people who have been traumatized by someone of another race. Then there are those who are paranoid about any contact with someone of another race. And then the fourth category, those who feel better by believing their race is superior.
What they do is they become hostile, aggressive, harassing, and that really they are markedly compromised.
And finally, there is what Dunbar calls antisocial.
Whatever the bias is, it has now really turned into some form of need psychologically to become aggressive.
And, says Dunbar, there's nothing in the DSM that recognizes any of these categories. But the DSM does contain some rare disorders.
Things such as trichotillomania, where people pull their hair out. There's a diagnosis currently in the DSM for caffeine intoxication. There is even a culture-bound syndrome referred to as brain fag, which means when you study too much, you just sort of aren't able to concentrate anymore.
But whether the diagnosis is in the DSM or not, says Dunbar, mental health professionals will be attempting to treat those whose racism is so toxic it causes them to want to harm others.
A hellish background doesn't make someone a furrow, or many of the other cases that have happened around in this country, but it surely creates the risk, and that's really the name of the game. Can we understand the risk that people with extreme racism pose to themselves and to the rest of us?
When we come back, a conversation with Dr. Alvin Poussant, who, as you saw, is urging his colleagues to label extreme racism as a mental illness. Joining me now, Dr. Alvin Poussant, a psychiatrist on the faculty at Harvard Medical School and a clinician at the Judge Baker Children's Center in Boston. We have, unfortunately, a wide variety of genocides over the past 100 years from which we can pick. Take any one of them. All the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands of people who participated in that extreme form of racism. Would you describe them all as mentally ill?
Well, some of them I would. Some of it are people who are following the crowd or the mob psychology. But I think a lot of them who carry out genocide are delusional about the people that they victimize. In other words, they're saying that all of these people are no good, they're inferior. It's a false belief. There's nothing you can say to change their mind. I think they're suffering from a paranoid delusion, and that's why they go out and they kill all of these victims.
Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between someone who is simply caught up in the mob mentality or caught up in his own fears?
Well, I think that in a number of ways. Some are clearly showing signs of paranoid delusional disorder, which is a psychotic disorder listed in the diagnostic manual. The other point is that many of these people are dysfunctional. In other words, their thinking and behavior makes it impossible for them to work, to do the everyday kinds of things with their families. And then they also become a threat to society. And a lot of their bigotry is tied into their own individual psychopathology. And that's what I think is very important for us to recognize. There may be racism polluting the atmosphere, but some people take it, particularly the extreme racists, and it becomes part of their personal psychopathology that is treatable and diagnosable as a mental condition.
Let's bring it closer to home. You and I have both seen those terrible photographs, some of them from as recently as the 1920s and 1930s, where a black man is being lynched. And when the camera pulls back a little bit and you look at the whole scene, there may be 5,000 people there having their sandwiches, munching on an apple, children with their parents, delighting in the scene. Mental illness?
Yeah, mental. Let's go to another level. Let's look at the cultural dimension. If a mental disorder, say like Nazis, really captivates all of the people and they're watching the Holocaust and they're laughing and they want to kill more, or you have people in those crowds watching lynching and they're all cheering for it, yes, I think all of them are disturbed, but I think we would have to deal with some of it on a social cultural level. But a lot of those individuals who want to kill and delight in killing because of their delusions about these people, I think are mentally troubled. Why I think that's important is I think that many of these people, if we caught them early enough and saw it as a psychiatric issue and problem, we could offer treatment. Right now, because we don't categorize it as a mental disorder, extreme racism, psychiatrists are ill-prepared. In fact, they don't even do research about it. The National Institute of Mental Health should be the leaders in studying the pathology, psychopathology of racism and seeing what we can do about it and also enabling psychiatrists to get training in how to deal with people, particularly people with extreme racism, to provide help for them.
You know, and we're running a little bit short on time, but you know that there are going to be a lot of people whose great concern is you're just looking for another way to get these guys off in the long run. So we're going to see case after case after case of smart defense lawyers bringing in people who have committed terrible racial crimes and saying, man's mentally disturbed.
But it doesn't work. The insanity defense doesn't work most of the time. It's not even used. When it is used, it's only a tiny, tiny percentage of people who get off on insanity defense. I think the important message is that people who are extreme racists are trouble, and that they're also in need of help. They'll get convicted, but I think that we can provide for them if we accept the fact that extreme racism is treatable, like other mental disorders, then everyone would benefit, and also we wouldn't get racists saying and believing, well, what I'm doing is extreme, but really it's normal. Everyone else is like that. It's not normal, and I don't think the society or psychiatrists should project to the people, to the American people, any people, that extreme racism is normal behavior.
Dr. Prasad, I thank you. Good of you to join us.
Thank you.
That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.